threatening that trying that reunification, that coming in for peace. Down here at the bottom it says the Copperhead Party in favor of vigorous protection of peace with a question mark. So they're not really sure how peaceful these people are actually being. Then Lincoln uses martial law, and he says, there are 13,000 people that are arrested and imprisoned kind of through Lincoln's national security, what he's trying to maintain. He says that all protests claiming, all of the people that are discouraging enlistment or discouraging people from coming in to serve for the army, or that are otherwise being disloyal, are subject to martial law, which means that he's can imprison them. And then, like I said, that's under the guise of national security. Abraham Lincoln is saying, look, if you're not with us, then you might be against us, and we can't have that. We're at war. Economic and social strains, you're going to see that there are, the textile industry is lacking cotton that it had previously gotten from the South, and the cheap shoe manufacturers in the North that were providing really the shoes for all of the slaves in the South, they don't have a market anymore. So these are hurt initially, but they are, they are not necessarily hurt for long, and there are a lot of other industries that are really booming instead because of the war. You'll see the bootmakers, shipbuilders, people that are making wool blankets, wool coats, iron industry that are making railroad ties, the coal industry. So many of these are booming as a result of the war. The McCormick brothers, they are the ones, we talked about them when we talked about kind of that coming of age into the early 1800s. They have invented the mechanical reaper, which a lot of people had kind of scoffed at early on. They're saying it's taken away that traditional hand reaping, all of that stuff. And now they are finding a wealth of money coming their way because they are people are buying them in the North because they are of a high demand for food, because a lot of the agriculture has been in the South. So now more people are needing to produce food. Women who have been left to fend the farms for themselves, their men are gone fighting, their sons are gone fighting, they see that because of the mechanized equipment like the mechanical reaper, they can now actually kind of manage that demanding task of harvesting food on their own. There are a lot of people who are getting wealth amid war. We just talked about the McCormick brothers who did that. Some people are doing it rightfully, and some of them are really taking advantage of war. These are kind of the speculators or profiteers of war. So there's a lot of people that are using their new money to help the war effort, and there's some that are just hoarding that effort, hoarding their money to themselves. And that also kind of contributes to some class problems that are going to come about. One of those is going to be inflation. We talked about inflation that had risen, and the last time you took notes, it was risen to 9,000% in the South, which is just an astronomical number. But it still had risen to 80% up north, which by comparison is far less than the South, but is still a lot compared to normal rates of inflation. It's really 3 times what is kind of normally acceptable. So we're talking in the North, we're talking about 80% inflation. Wages are not rising at the same rate that inflation is rising. If inflation is going about 15% a year, wages are rising less than half of that each year. So this is going to lead to unions being formed and strikes being held. These unions that are being formed are there's really kind of like tailors, coal miners, railroad engineers. They are all forming unions during this time. Manufacturers are obviously vastly opposed to these, and they will hire strike breakers. If these people they go on strike, they will send in strike breakers, which are typically immigrants who haven't obtained citizenship yet, or they are free African Americans or women. And this is obviously going to make a lot of people super angry and really lays the foundation for the conflict between manufacturers and laborers in the late 19th century. The last problem that's causing a lot of social strain is conscription or the draft, requiring people between a certain age to come enroll in the military. This happens officially in the Union in March of 1863. And so this phrase that they're kind of coming up with here, $300 or your life, is referring to the fact that a lot of people are allowed substitutions. They're saying that you can pay $300 and then somebody can come fight on your behalf. A lot of times those are going to be these immigrants who aren't officially citizens and aren't officially eligible for the draft. So somebody would pay $300, have this immigrant come in and serve for them instead. So the problem with that is that $300 is almost a whole year's wages for an unskilled laborer. So the fact that they're saying that rich people can afford these substitutions but poor people can't. And they're calling that part of the draft legislation aristocratic legislation, and it's saying that where we had talked about in the South, saying that this is a rich man's fight but a poor man, or rich man's war but a poor man's fight. Some of the ones in the North are starting to agree with that. They're saying you're giving the rich people the option to not serve, while we don't have that option because we don't make that kind of money. The New York City draft riots are the best example we have of how big the class divisions were over the draft. Spring of 1863, like we said, March of 1863 is when they come in and the draft is official. So throughout that spring of that year, you're going to have a lot of riots all over the place, not just in New York City, but in many areas in the North. And you're going to end up having lots of enrollment officers that are killed as a result of the riots. But the biggest riot that you have because of the draft is going to be in New York City from July 13th to July 16th of 1863. You're going to see that there's a lot going on as working class people are looting businesses and homes, they're fighting in the streets, and there's lynching of African Americans that are really becoming the target for a lot of these, the anger of these people. If you've ever seen the movie Gangs of New York, it takes place in New York in 1863 in the Five Points district. And that is really just an example of the violence and that was going on in New York at the time, and the murder really is just a commonplace thing. So while Gangs of New York is not specifically talking about the draft riots, it is the same time and same place, and really showing just the social tensions and the problems that are going on. To get it to stop, you have just had the week before, you have Gettysburg is going on, which is the bloodiest battle of the whole war, and we're going to talk more about that this week. But 5 of these Union troops that had been fighting in Gettysburg have to rush into New York City to stop this whole riot from going on any longer. Like I said, African Americans are the ones that are targeted, but we'll see in just a second that they're really the ones that are going to help fix some of this issue. One of the problems obviously is the draft, but just the urban conditions and the overcrowding and the sanitation and the people just living up on top of one another, the gap between the rich and the poor growing wider and wider is accompanying with the draft to make this whole riot happen. What African Americans are doing to help fix the issue is that they, in 1863, are now eligible to serve in the military. They hadn't been able to do that previously, but with the Emancipation Proclamation, they now can. Like you guys have been able to see when I post on Edmodo the clip from Glory, you'll see that there are a lot of free blacks that are now rushing to serve in the Union Army. They then fill that gap that was, the draft is trying to fix the need for soldiers, and with African Americans now being able to serve, they fix some of that. The failure of Southern nationalism. We talked already about Jefferson Davis. He's obviously the president, and he has a lot of control over the government. In fact, he's kind of making all the decisions, by himself. He has very centralized control over the economy and the military, and a lot of people are not happy about that. And they're also not accustomed to the amount of urban growth that is taking place. Because this new government is in Richmond, there are just a flood of these people working now for the government. 70,000 people is in the bureaucracy for the Confederate government, and they've all flooded into Richmond. They're not used to that. They're also having women in the workforce. Like we said, a lot of men are all fighting, so now women are coming to fill some of those positions, and not everybody is okay with that change that's kind of coming about in the South. Certainly pre-war that would never have happened. And then they have a need for soldiers as well, which accompanies that class kind of antagonism, or that difference between the rich and the poor. We talked about the fact that these small farmers are going off to war, and their wives and their families are struggling. They don't have the help of the mechanical reaper like we talked about up north, that's allowing women up north to be able to continue, making the family farm happen. it's too expensive, A, and it's not something available in the South, B. And also, they're going to have no slaves on those farms, which they never owned in the first place. But now, even those that had slaves, those that have slaves are now exempt from having to go and fight in war. So you're going to see these small yeoman farmers really kind of having that resentment towards those that do have slaves, because now not only do they have slaves to help their farms keep going, but they don't even have to go to war because they have so many slaves. While on the other hand, they're having to go to war, they don't have any slaves, and their farms are struggling. You're going to see that just some of these substitutions are still being, still going on, and you'll see that there are really about 50,000 upper-class Southerners who avoid going to the military at all by paying money for substitutes, and a lot of money in some cases. And even with that, there's a lot of desertion as well. So that soldier need, that class antagonism is just ongoing. There is a lot of starvation. We talked about the blockades already, where they're blockading the ports, the seaports, but they're also northern troops are coming down the rivers. There is just a lack of food everywhere, and because of that, you're having women who are just angry because they can't get what they need, and so that contributes to the inflation. We talked about that just a second ago, being 9,000%. That is just a ridiculous number, and it really makes it hard for them to buy anything. Their money's not worth anything. So even what little money they have, the value is so low that they can't buy what they need. And that's going to lead to some food riots. Like we talked about the draft riots up in the north in 1863, there were some food riots in several cities in the South, including Atlanta, some others in Georgia, North Carolina. There's a lot of places, Richmond. There's just a lot of women mostly. They're breaking into bakeries. They're taking bread and running away, trying to just feed their families. Davis has to come out and really threaten them at gunpoint to get them to stop rioting. But you can see that the stores there are selling things. They're $6 for a dozen eggs, $25 for a pound of butter. These are just, that's a really high amount for us now, and back in 1863, that's just ridiculous amounts to pay for food. So people that have large families just don't know what to do. Another thing that's occurring, this kind of failure of nationalism, and as they're having so many problems in the Confederacy, you're going to see a vast difference between black and white relations. So while you've got this ruling class that had kind of been running the show up until the war, now everything is altered for them. Nothing is the same anymore. We already talked about that 1 million slaves have fled to the Union lines and that are helping the Union Army or living up north now. That's a quarter of all the slaves that were in the South. And as kind of white men and the overseers, they've left to go join the Army, that leaves the white women back at home, and they're the ones dealing with the lack of food, having to manage the farm, and all of the slaves that are on these plantations. And women have not played the primary role. They haven't had that patriarchal kind of authority that their husbands had. So now they're having a hard time and a shift in relationship. And you can see that slaves, when they're leaving, they're starting to, even those that stay, are acting differently and are treating that relationship with white owners much differently. Some of them are really there making the decision of when and how they're going to work and what manner they're going to do things. And really, they're saying things that they would never have said before, refusing punishments or insubordination in ways that was never imagined before the war. This quote right here is talking about an instance where the Union Army has come into this town where this lady is living, and she's begging her female slave. She's saying, don't tell them about this trunk that I buried that's got my gold in it and it's got my silver plates in it. Don't tell them when they get here where it's at. And she's telling her, she said, I'm not going to lie for you. You bought that plate when you sold my kids. And that would have never happened before, but because of the change in relationships and the change in the nature of things in the South, you see many more examples of this. And Alexander Stephens, not everybody is on board with the Confederacy. We talked about Jefferson Davis. Obviously, he's the president of the Confederacy, but Alexander Stephens is his vice president. And unfortunately for Davis, Stephens is the one leading the opposition against him, his own vice president. Early in 1864, he's the one that's going to suggest negotiating for peace. But Davis, obviously being president, has none of that and has enough support in the Confederate Congress to